The all-new Dodge Charger, the all-new Rivian R2 and R3. Will Apple buy Rivian? Hyundai finally releases pricing on the new Hyundai Ionia 5N, and of course Porsche announces a new highest-end version of the Taycan. We're going to be talking about all those things and more in today's podcast. Alright, so let's go ahead and kick things off by talking about the news from the past week, and I think the biggest thing from this past week is that Dodge finally announced the new Dodge Charger, and there were a couple surprises in there. What wasn't a surprise is that this does have an EV version. However, a surprise was that the gas version is also going to be available. Every single one of the models is going to be all-wheel drive only. Right now, there are no plans for a rear-wheel drive version. And then, of course, there is not going to be a Hemi. One of the biggest surprises to me is the fact that there's going to be a two-door and a four-door version of this vehicle. Interestingly enough, to make that happen, the body of both versions is almost identical, with the two-door having a little bit longer front doors and obviously no rear doors. In the four-door version, is essentially moving the B-pillar farther forward, giving you shorter front doors, but giving you the practicality of having rear doors as well. It's an interesting way of doing it. Now, as for the powertrains, there is going to be the gas version is going to be coming in form of an inline-six turbocharged Hurricane motor. We've been seeing that engine in the Jeep Wagoneer, of which I recently reviewed. And right now it's going to be coming out in either a 420 horsepower or a 550 horsepower version. But right now we don't have any 0 to 60 times on those. As for the EV version, they're calling it the Charger Daytona and the Daytona RT, with the RT version going up to 670 horsepower. It sounds like the EV version is going to be available later this year, and it's going to still be a 2024 model year vehicle, which is interesting considering how far forward a lot of these manufacturers are announcing their vehicles. Outside of that, one of the weirdest things about the Charger announcement was this really strange, really long commercial. I don't know if you've seen it yet, however, it's just this weird kind of CGI version of where the current CEO of Dodge goes back in time and tries to convince the founders of Dodge to like this new electric version of the Charger. It's kind of a weird concept, and I don't really understand what they were going for there, other than maybe just getting people to talk about the car, which I guess makes sense. But that is the new Dodge Charger. Make sure to leave down in the comments what you guys think about the new Charger. Is it a good replacement for the last generation that had been around since 2005? The next biggest news over the past week, of course, is the fact that Rivian announced the new R2, which we've been expecting for a long time. This is going to be a much more budget version of the original R1S, and they did come through with that. Of course, it is a mid-size SUV. It's going to come out in 2026, and it's going to be sitting around $45,000 price point. And the styling honestly is very, very similar to the R1S, which is the SUV version of the main segment of the cars that they've been selling for a long time. It has a 300-mile range and a 0 to 60 of around 3 seconds. One of the most interesting features is that it does have a Rolls-Royce-like umbrella that you can pull out of the door. Now, that all was kind of expected. Everyone knew that the R2 was going to be coming out, and a lot of the details had already kind of leaked. However, what Rivian did a really good job of is keeping their second announcement and even third announcement a secret. That would be the R3 and the R3X, which is a more compact version of the R2. It sits on the same platform, but it is a little bit smaller and kind of has a hatchback look to it. Now, pricing of this smaller SUV is going to start around $37,000, and I think it gets up to around $45,000 if you option it completely out. And the R3X is the R3, but essentially a more performance-oriented and kind of off-roady rally car version of it that I actually really like the styling of. And I've been reading up on it, and it sounds like a lot of the inspiration of this vehicle came from a lot of 80s rally cars like the Lancia Delta and then the Audi Quattro. As for my opinion on these, I think these are going to be really, really cool SUVs. I think this is something that the market has been asking for. Sure, EV demand is slowed down, like I talked about in my last podcast. However, I think pricing is really starting to come down. These are still performance-oriented vehicles. I think Rivian makes a fantastic product, and I've been a fan of them for quite some time now. So I'm really excited to see these come out, and I really hope they do work. Then one piece of news that I want to add to this is there's some speculation going on right now that Rivian might be bought out by Apple. Now, there's really no facts going along with this. However, it is an interesting thing to think about because Apple did just announce that they're canceling the Apple Car. And honestly, Rivian has a lot of the aesthetics that Apple likes and a lot of the simplicity and that kind of stuff that Apple has been a big fan of. So I'll be interested to see if Apple uses some of their extra cash to maybe buy Rivian and get into the car game that way instead of developing their own platform like they have in the past decade or so. The next piece of news, it just came out earlier this morning when I'm filming, and that would be the Hyundai Ionia N is finally getting its pricing, and it's a good deal, but it's also not. So they've announced it's going to be around $66,100 to get yourself into a Hyundai Ionia N, and that is without shipping charges, which I think is around $1,300, but that's not that big of a deal. Now, of course, if you don't know what the Hyundai Ionia N is, it is the performance version, the N version of the Hyundai Ionia 5, which I am a big fan of. I think it is just a really, really cool design vehicle. It's a decent sized SUV, but has kind of compact vehicle styling. I actually saw some people getting into one the other day, and it always surprises me how big it is but how small it looks. But some of the things that the new N version gets you is some special features basically that allow you to get better track times. So what it does is it basically can set the temperature of the battery to better give you 0 to 60 times, give you better track times, and that kind of stuff. It's kind of like warming up your engine, but it's warming up a battery instead. It has specialized regenerative braking, a specialized braking package, and then you can even brake with your left foot, which is something that's not common in EVs yet. And who can forget that it has launch control, which with the 641 horsepower that it gets, can get you 0 to 60 in just 3.25 seconds. I think this is a cool vehicle that I've been waiting for a long time, and I'd love to get my hands on a review someday. Then the final piece of news before we get into the other segments on this podcast is that Porsche just announced a new top-tier version of the Porsche Taycan, which is called the Turbo GT, and then the Turbo GT with the Weissach package. Now this is starting out at $230,000, which is just crazy money for a vehicle like this. And their goal really is to continue to compete with things like the Tesla Model S Plaid, as it gets a 0 to 60 in 2.1 seconds and has 1,019 horsepower, followed up by 988 pound-foot of torque. And then has a top speed of 190 miles per hour. What do you think about the Taycan Turbo GT? It's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's something that anybody has really been asking for, but it's a pretty cool vehicle. Now, before we get onto the car of the week, I do want to give you guys the Bible verse of the week, which this week it is Matthew 6:19 through 21. And let me read it off to you. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon the earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth consume, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where thy treasure is, there thy heart will be also. I think this is a really interesting verse for us, especially that rust component, and realizing that about all these really cool cars that we're talking about all the time ultimately don't matter, and really finding your faith in Jesus is what matters the most. And with that, let's move on to the car of the week, which of course is one of my all-time favorite cars, and that would be the 5th gen Toyota Celica. I think the Toyota Celica is a fantastic vehicle. I've been a huge fan of the 5th gen. I've had 4 of them personally, and I'm constantly excited to see new ones. I've recently been talking and chatting with somebody recently that has a 5th gen Toyota Celica GT4 RC, and it's just a cool car that I've been watching for a really long time. Of course, it came in a bunch of different versions. There's the ST, which is kind of your base version. There's the GT, GTS, the All-Track, the GT4, which are the same thing depending on where in the world you are. And I've always been a really, really big fan of these Celicas. They're an awesome way to get into a sports car, of something that's reliable, easy to drive, fun to drive, and easy to fix. I don't know. It's just a car I've always really liked. If you've never looked into them, I would highly recommend it because it's a car that is just really fun to drive. They may not have crazy amounts of horsepower and not crazy amounts of all these different specs, but it's just very manual vehicle and a ton of fun to drive. I've always really enjoyed them, and I continue to enjoy them, even though the first one I think I had when I was like 15 or 16 years old. And ever since then, I've just been a big fan of those vehicles, and I hope to have one here soon, maybe being a project on this channel. And then for the last segment in this podcast, what's going on in my world? And I'll be honest, it's a lot of this podcast. So I am still trying to kind of figure out what this podcast is going to look like. I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments what you think would make a great thing on this podcast. I'm hoping not only to be talking about news and stuff like that, like I am in this current podcast, but also do interviews and learning hearing about people that are car enthusiasts and have awesome cars. I'd love to interview them and get their thoughts and what their past is like in finally getting into the vehicle that they have now. I'd also love to interview other influencers in the automotive segment and that kind of stuff. So I'd love to hear who you guys want to hear from, not just me, but other people and other people that own different awesome cars. I just love to hear from you guys in the comments on what segments and types of people that you would like to hear from on this channel. And then of course, outside of that, I have been writing a ton on ReadySetRev.com, so make sure to go check out some of the recent articles just to kind of check out what I have been talking about on there. Thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast. I can't wait to talk to you guys about what's going on in the past week, next week, and I look forward to talking to you guys then. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you like content like this.